Hi, my name is Pete Kelly. I'm chair of the.
Oh, I'm Bob, and I'm not the chair. I'm Rick Pagano.
Roberta Scholes.
I'm John Clarice, I'm also the host.
Well, I always refer to it as our, what did I call it? Our, not cooperative, but collective, exactly. Collective, because we kind of run it on consensus. And I may be the chair, but we have a process here. And anything I write, I send to Bob and he corrects.
Guitarist.
John.
Rick, an extraordinary carpenter. And for instance, these things he hung on panels, Rick did that. And he used to do this, what he's doing for us for the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And he's also a Morro Bay local going back for at least generations. Roberta Scholes has been a longtime board member and also our treasurer for the Historical Society. We went to Cal Poly together, and she is the creative force on the committee. Don is our newcomer, and Don, you can tell them about yourself.
Well, I'm also a docent. I've been a docent since 2019. I'm also an investigative reporter and a researcher, and I wrote a docent training manual. And I am just blown away by the rich history of San Luis Obispo County. It blows my mind.
Okay, well, why this exhibit? You know, years ago, I was talking to my farmer buddy, Rick Lewis, and his dad bought George Steele's estate, which is basically Edna Valley. And George Steele, who was very, very famous in this county during the time of the Farmers Alliance and during the time when the railroads first came through, was very, very influential in organizing farmers first into the Grange, then the Farmers Alliance. And he had opened this huge, bought all the land from Francisco Branch, bought Edna Valley plus a lot more, and did the largest and most modern dairy in the United States and one of the biggest in the county. And we try to say that George Steele was the first big dairy guy in San Luis. There's people that will argue that slightly, like the Hollisters, but basically George Steele, because of his organizational activities and what he did, was known as the primary dairyman in San Luis, and they brought in special dairy cattle from all over the world and everything. Okay, well, eventually that all went away. Mr. Lewis bought the farm, and in the 50s, they decided to tear down George Steele's old house, which I think was called, is it Oak Knoll? It says on that right up there. At any rate, Rick Lewis, who's my age, decided he knew up in the attic there were these books. And so he went and grabbed the books before they tore down the house. Good move. One of them was George Steele's commencement book, which we're displaying right in that glass case. And in it, George Steele wrote, remember, this is the largest employer in the county at this time. And so he wrote down whoever started to work on the Steele Ranch from like 1862 to 1890s, what their name was, how much they got paid, what they did. So it's a tremendous primary document, right? And you can look through it and say, hey, wait a minute, look at it. You know, here's an Italian, a Swiss Italian, here's a Portuguese, here's, in some cases, they just say a Chinaman. In other cases, they would say an Indian boy. And then in the other cases, they would give their names. So we had this tremendous document. about when people commence to work. And then I'm of the philosophy that great men don't make history. So it wasn't John Hartford or William Randolph Hearst or whoever that made this county. It was the people that worked it with their hands, the Chinese that built the railroad for Hartford, or the people that took care of the cattle for George Steele, that kind of thing. So therefore, that's what this working hands exhibit is. It just, we tried, without mentioning everybody, there's certain groups that aren't in here. And for instance, I'm Irish, and the Irish weren't in here. And you'll notice in George Steele's book, the earliest employees were Irish. And of course, St. Louis has kind of forgot about the Irish, except for the Irish Hills. And the famous bar that we all went to, the Irishman. Okay, so we left out the Irish, which someone should do an exhibit someday as the Irish in California, because it's really fascinating. Anyway, so we decided we'd take certain groups and we would write about them. And this is just, all these things are the tip of the iceberg. In other words, whole exhibits could have been done on each one of these groups, but we just wanted to give you a sample, of what's going on. And we decided, well, there was one thing that both the Portuguese, Japanese, and Chinese did, and that was to fish for abalone. So we decided, since it's working hands, we would throw up a little thing for the abalone divers, who were a very big deal in this county. During the Great Depression, the abalone fishery in Avila and Morro Bay kept us from suffering heavily, because there were plenty of jobs that were tied in with the abalone industry. Boat repair, processing the bars. Abalone tended to drink quite a bit because they spent 10 hours a day underwater in dry suits, right around the bottom, trying to get as many abalones as possible. So, see that big red abalone up there? Tony Sylvester of Avila has the record. One day he got 200 dozen of those by hand. As you see, the abalone were pretty abundant. Okay, so we investigated the different groups. Depression, they actually preserved a lot of documents, historical documents. And we found out, going through those documents, a lot of interesting things, like that Jackie Robinson was working as a counselor in Paso Robles, in a Atascadero for the CCC before he ever became famous at all. So that's kind of how we got here. Bob, you got anything to add to all that?
Well, actually, he was famous from his UCLA football days.
Oh, okay.
And then after UCLA, he wanted to play professional baseball. You can go look up, in the old newspapers, of course, it was just Jackie Robinson. It wasn't Jackie Robinson, major leaguer. It was just,
Jackie Robinson.
Jackie Robinson, football player. And there used to be a lot of town teams in those days. Everybody had a team. Creston would have a team. Avila had 3 teams. You can imagine, there were 6 people living in that, was all they marked.
There were a lot more people living in Avalon than there are now.
But they, anyway. He was part of those he's part of one of those baseball teams, at that time. And so that was interesting. That was just one more thing. Yeah, we just went through all these, it's like Pete was saying, this is just kind of an overview of what they did. You could do a PhD thesis on every single one of these, you know, and write a book and do all that, but the banners aren't that big.
Rick, you want to add anything? You don't have to.
Well, just my bit on the Japanese is basically on my knowledge of my family and the photographs came from an old album that my grandfather had. So our family has been farming in Morro Bay since 1950, and then before that there were 3 brothers that were farming in Shell Beach. And then about 1915, they each took a different farm, one in Los Osos, one stayed in Shell Beach, and my grandfather went to Morro Bay. We've been there ever since.
So, may I know how this happened? The land, farming.
Japanese couldn't own property. Japanese couldn't own property at that time. And so my oldest uncle was born in 1916, and he turned 21 in 1937. And my grandfather was able to buy that property under his name since he was born in the States. Then he was a citizen. So that was fortunate for my family. Many didn't have that option. That's how we ended up with that. I think my uncle, the Eto family in Los Osos, they owned that property before, but that might have been before they were, I'm not sure how they came by that property. But they did own that. They started out mainly with flower seeds and beans, but mainly flowers, photos of growing flowers, seed.
What's a horse feed? What's a horse feed?
I'm not really sure. I think it's like a farm.
Yeah, it must be large, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if they were used for horse feed or, but that's how they're labeled in the photo well. It's like harvesting horse feed.
Were they on poles with string like chickpeas?
No, they also grew a lot of bush beans.
Farmer beans, bush.
That was. Nature proposed there. I thought they were more like similar to string beans, but I don't know anything about farming.
Well, the thing that I found out when we were doing an exhibit, the Patriot Coast exhibit, one Japanese family that was farming out there at Point Bouchon, one of the guys said, you know, when we were kids, we were so poor that all we had to eat was rice, abalone, and Brussels sprouts. And I was sitting there thinking, boy, that cost you $70 a plate now. But anyway, Rick's dad was captured and thrown into a concentration camp, just like you're hearing on the news people today. Well, people got real pissed off in San Luis. And his dad wrote an essay on it. And his dad was just trying to deliver 2 cases of oranges that he had promised to the train station in San Luis when they grabbed him. And it almost caused a riot. So there were people in this county that were against all that. And of course, they saved some of their property and farms also. You know, the one everybody knows about is the Hayashi's farm being saved. So that was just something I always like to bring up, because that's really a neat story.
And in terms of people going forward, you mentioned already, we're touching a time when farming was so basic. They were not big owners, rich people.
Oh, no,
They
no,
were
no.
just feeding themselves and others. As you said, it was just basic to go and
Well,
drink.
to a certain extent, except for the fact, what was it, Rick? After internment, California lost 40% of their fresh vegetables, or was it even higher? Yeah, so after they interned everybody, suddenly there was 40% less vegetables. So the vegetables being grown by these Japanese, they had co-ops in Oceano especially, and this stuff was being exported, I mean, to other parts of California, probably other parts of the nation. You know, there was a lot of train traffic going on at that time. So they were very organized, and like I said, at least 40% of the fresh produce in California.
Yeah, over here, the Rick Road on this manor, before 1940, with less than 2% of the farmland in California, Japanese Americans produced over 1/3 of the state's fruits and vegetables.
So on 2% of the land, a third, yeah.
I just wanted to comment that my research with the Japanese was that when they were interned, that unfortunately the strawberries, they were the only ones that knew how to grow
To grow strawberries.
strawberries. And so it vanished from here. And then once the Japanese came back and reintroduced the strawberry, that's how we have the strawberries today.
And we sure have, I think it's, one year was the major crop in the county. I think it was last year, it was even more than wine, grapes, and cattle. So strawberries are, you know, they're a big deal.
And I heard they're opening up the strawberry stands down in South County, so hurry down.
And Arroyo Grande has the Strawberry Festival.
Yes.
Roberta,
Yes.
You're up.
Okay, I'll talk about what that WPA part of the exhibit is. The stock market crash was in the fall of 1929, and almost right away, 1930, desperate people started showing up in the county. And so there were so many people who showed up that the Paso Robles City Council considered feeding all the migrants who came in exchange for cutting firewood for the community. I couldn't find that they actually passed, but they considered it anyway. Anyway, that's how many people were showing up immediately. And there were only 29,000 people in the county in the 1930 census. And so having this influx of people who were hungry and desperate, it fell on community groups and individuals to feed them. And so the number of migrant farm workers really increased once the Depression really got going. And so by 1932, there's an article in the Tribune over here about that the farmer would pay a labor contractor who organized bringing in all the migrant workers, And then the labor contractor would pay the workers well. The farmer paid the labor contractor and he absconded with the funds. And so the migrant workers were in a situation where every last penny went for either food or gas to get them to the next site for picking crops. And so they were going hungry. And so the migrants were fed by community groups and individuals. Again, it was very haphazard and just people doing it on their own. And so that's once the WPA is in play, then there will be a situation in 36 where the WPA rises to the occasion. So that's kind of the difference between before the Roosevelt administration started organizing these various projects and agencies. Yes?
When you're done, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So are you thinking that the WPA wasn't here until 36?
No, it came in 35.
It actually came here in 29. The mission wall around the corner, fine. It's the only one that I have that it's 29.
No, it didn't even, the Roosevelt administration didn't even come into existence until
The
30.
date on that says WPA
I'll
1929.
bet it says 30.
39.
Yeah, probably because,
Yeah,
Well, and they are around here. I got pictures usually.
yeah, there's a picture over here of it being built. And it was part of the full construction part of the WPA.
Okay.
Anyway, so FDR is inaugurated in March of 33, and that's where we got that 100 days for various administrations was from the first Roosevelt administration. His idea was to just try all sorts of things, see what worked. Employment so high, there were so many people. One of the agencies was that a government agency like a county or a city would propose to the WPA a project that they wanted to do, and the county would pay anywhere from 10 to 30% of whatever the cost would be, and then the WPA would pay for labor and for much of the equipment. Well, the first things that the Board of Supervisors in San Luis proposed were they wanted the Morro Bay breakwater, and there's a photo of trucks working on that, and housekeeping for disabled people, and paving roads. So many of the roads, rural roads and streets in the towns were not paved, so that in the winter, many of the rural roads were impassable. Like you couldn't get over Perfuma Canyon in the winter usually. So those were the first requests that the Board of Supervisors requested to the WPA, and basically 80% of the projects in this county were construction, and so they were the roads, building roads, paving roads, bridges, culverts. And then, of course, the courthouse, the wall over here, and 2 fire stations, one in San Luis, one in Paso, the Cambria Elementary School, a lot of different public buildings. They did improvements to Camp San Luis even before everyone was gearing up for World War II. And but the other 20% of WPA projects were things like first aid classes. They trained and hired lifeguards for Avila Beach, and the number of drownings went down significantly after they had lifeguards the first time. And they had recreation. They, baseball teams and various recreation groups. They had school lunches, and they even had an orchestra, a dance orchestra for people who couldn't afford to go to pay for all of the dance orchestras who would come through this county. And when I was looking through the Tribune, all of the major dance orchestras, Benny Goodman, all of them, they all came through here, but there were a lot of people who couldn't afford it. But my favorite project that they did was a Christmas party in Atascadero. They've fixed up furniture and toys for people who and had a Christmas party for them. So, because the attitude of Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's right hand, well, until Hopkins died during the war, but he was Roosevelt's emissary all during the war, and Harry Hopkins ran the WPA, and what he said was that artists need to eat too, because there was a lot of pushback for the WPA paying for things like, murals and paintings and dance orchestras. And, but, it couldn't just be people who were doing construction. So there were 1,200 people. I did want to say how it worked. The WPA they would hire people for 18 months, but then you had to be furloughed for 30 days before you could go back on, and they hired people who had been on relief from the California program before the Roosevelt administration, which it was very, very minimal. But and there were only 1,200 people in the county who were receiving relief. So there were 2 camps and a lot of outside people. There was one in Santa Margarita, and then the CCC camp in Morro Bay, which built a lot of the Morro Bay State Park, the bathrooms and all. There were so people came in from elsewhere and lived in barracks, and they did a lot of the work rather than locals, and they were paid less than the market rate, because the idea was to not have it as an ongoing thing if unemployment dropped and jobs started being available. So once we got on a war footing, and armament and all the armament manufacturing and all the rest of it started gearing up and unemployment went down, then you don't see any construction projects or anything. It all gears towards the war effort until it disbands in 1943, because by then unemployment was very low.
If they were doing so much construction, who would
In the field.
I think it was the peas, and we had a freeze, and the crop was ruined. So once again, the migrant workers were going hungry, and so the WPA sent 20,000 pounds of food up from LA to feed them. So in 1932 and 1936 went from a haphazard way of taking care of people who were in dire straits to actually looking to the government to provide a solution to situations like this. And was WPA for a division of the WPA to go around conditions and farm workers. So that's how we get all these photos, including the famous Florence Thompson, the migrant mother, Dorothea Langwood had been a society portrait photographer, and she was supposedly very good at getting people to feel at ease and so that she could take their photos. So you'll see several of her photos here.
A lot of those WPA projects, of course, are still around. I mean, we still use them every day. If you walk around the Home District, like on Charles Street by Mountain View and, that area, you can see stamped in the curbs, WPA. And there's a photo over here, one of the, like Bert was saying, the culverts. There's a photo over here of one of the walls that this is a WPA project, and you can see the little monument that they put, kind of like they have at the Mission. There's another one on O'Connor Road. You can see it's WPA, and the construction is with rocks and things, so it's going to last a long time. And the construction's pretty much the same, but there were lots of WPA things around. The high school used to have the WPA wall by the old gym. And I don't know what happened to that. I hope they saved it. They're a school, for God's sake. This is the, geez, yeah, I'm a former principal here.
What was the local cultural aspect and what saloons, theaters, what did they do when orchestra didn't come? Was there any cultural stuff here? And the second question also is about crime. What was the crime? How was the crime in this area?
I can answer.
The crime area?
Juvenile delinquency was just completely out of hand. I mean, that's all they talked about. And so what they did, they took the Avila School and they set it up as a model for reaching out to youth and getting them involved in other things. But that was a big deal in that time, juvenile delinquents, okay? Besides that, the entertainment was, your Elmo Theater and your regular stuff.
Well, and the WPA had all those recreation projects, the teams and all. Well, that's what part of the thinking for setting up the CCC, because they were young men who were working on conservation projects, was they were very afraid of idle young men.
Yeah.
So
As well they should be.
so that was the idea behind the CCC, was to get young men working on conservation projects. And the CCC would pay the young men a portion of their wages and send the rest directly to their family.
One of the other things that they did was, CCC was, the WPA was also involved in the arts in so many ways. You mentioned murals, and don't forget the the state by state books that they made.
Oh, yeah.
Because you bought one.
Yes.
For every state, they sent authors around, and they would go through, there's one big fat one in California, and they would go through all these towns and do little write-ups for all the towns. And it's really quite interesting, and reading the ones from this area, a lot of it is accurate. And some of it's not, but there were, and I can't remember the names, but I've read about them before we started this. There were a number of famous authors that were hired to do that. It was quite a project. The WPA did so many things, and Roosevelt was trying to give people jobs and pump money into the economy to get us out of the Depression. Of course, it really took the war to do that, but.
How did the craftsmanship seem so good in all their projects? I mean, the sidewalks are still existing.
What's that?
The craftsmanship of the WPA seems so good. How does you account for that? Why-
And look at the back of that culvert on Choro Street.
Right, yeah.
That is beautiful. And that's 90 years old. Yeah.
Modern stuff. Yeah, the sidewalks are all built. So it's like there was a great deal of knowledge for the people in charge.
And pride in their workmanship.
That's
And the San Francisco had a large project for artists, and they would send down paintings for our libraries. And apparently that was a big hit whenever there would be a new shipment of paintings.
What was it, didn't there a high school in San Francisco that had one? And they
Oh, yes, yeah.
I mean, recently they.
They wanted to board it up, and then they decided
So
not to.
modern times. You gonna talk about each one of these, or?
Well, they're pretty self-explanatory, I think.
Okay.
You read the text, you pretty much get the idea.
What about the cartoons or whatever, what are these?
Oh, yeah.
They're very posted.
Yeah, okay, so as you'll read on the text next to it, there was whaling going on in San Syrian and Port San Luis. Okay. 100% of the whalers were from the Azore Islands. I have a book that mentions all the whalers, how old they were, what they got paid. Okay. So basically, they would row out in a skiff when a whale would come by, and they'd harpoon it and drag it in. Okay. This was very important. This is how you read your books at night, was from whale oil. Okay, it was the offshore wind of its era. Little less complicated.
Then you mentioned how they were on the East Coast and moved.
Yeah, well, basically what happened was the Azores in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean were where, after everybody hunted the whales locally, let's say Nantucket, then they got bigger ships and started traveling all over the world looking for whales. Okay. The place they would want to get a crew from was the Azores, because the Azoreans were the best whalers and the best sailors, and also because they were an agriculture community besides fishing on the Azores, and they had large families. They couldn't afford to live there, so they wanted to migrate to the United States. We could get a job on a whale boat, get paid, and end up in New York or New England. Okay. And then eventually, and that's the Sylvesters and Avila, they started out in New England and eventually made their way to the West Coast. Okay, it got so bad that the Portuguese Navy had to blockade the Azores because they wanted to use some of the Azorean in their own Navy crews. Okay, so then, and believe it or not, this is what I couldn't believe, but it's true. Even in the 1860s, California closed the whaling season during the summer. That's when the gray whales migrate. So they actually, can you believe that? In the 1860s, closed the whaling season. So what did these Portuguese whalers do? Well, they knew a lot about the dairy industry and they knew about farms. So they got jobs on local farms. Then when the whaling season opened, they went back and they were getting paid well as whalers. And then finally, when it all ended, they either homesteaded or bought farms and then they become dairymen.
Here they are.
And here they are, yeah, to this very day. And what I've always thought about the Portuguese is they preserved their own culture and yet became part of the mainstream culture without losing either. You see what I mean? So you gotta hand them a lot of credit for that. And really, when I came to this county 65 years ago, I didn't even know what a Portuguese was.
Yeah, were in the research that we were doing, I happened to go through an old newspaper. And there was a Portuguese festival, which they still do today, of course.
Right.
And and I think it was 1919, something like that. And I mean, that wasn't that interesting because we knew that they would do that. The interesting part was they had two speakers, one in English and one speaker in Portuguese. So even back then, and the same way with the Swiss Italians, there was a big Swiss celebration. And two speakers, one in English, one in Italian. They didn't lose, even to this day, of course, they didn't lose their heritage, even though they were Americans.
And they've just revived getting together.
Sorry?
The Swiss Italians have used to get together and they've just revived it.
Oh, revived it, yeah.
Do you have a Swiss day? Where?
They have it at the ranch.
Okay.
And Swiss Italians used to be celebrated Italian Independence Day. Swiss Independence Day used to be celebrated countywide. I worked on the Swiss Italians. I was amazed that all of the Italian names in this county are not from Italy, they're from Switzerland. The Swiss migration started from Switzerland dairy area to the North Bay, Marin County and Mendocino County. And then after about 20 years, they realized there's good dairy land in San Luis Obispo County. So in the 1880s, they started to move from the North Bay to San Luis Obispo County. And then the word got back to Switzerland, don't bother with the North Bay, come directly to San Luis Obispo. And at one point there were most of the Swiss Italian dairy farms, that's what they did mostly, was dairy farming, were around the Cayucas area. And then Edna Valley had a lot too.
So they bought the land, they had money to buy land and so on.
Yes, but the interest in Swiss Independence Day was so popular among non-Swiss residents of San Luis Obispo County because of the Swiss patriotism for America.
And, to your point about the Swiss Italians being Swiss and not Italians, when my family first moved to San Luis Obispo in 1953, we were Italian. And my dad was looking at the phone book and saw all these Italian names and my mom was just, oh, good, there's a lot of Italians here, My mom's mom didn't even speak English, she only spoke Italian. Anyway, then they found out they were all Swiss and it didn't quite work.
I can speak to that because when I went to the gathering, they said, actually, some of them do identify as Italian Swiss.
Yeah.
It's like there are arguments between them, but some families do identify themselves more
They
Italian.
snuck over the border. We're Southern Italian, so the northern.
Well, the picture up there is a celebration. It's from one of the Swiss Independence Day celebrations, and a lot of them are non-Swiss.
Everyone loves a party, right?
Right.
And just as a point of reference, George Steele came from Marin, and the Steele family was the one that started those dairies in Marin, actually at that, what's that area in Marin County that's a national seashore? Point Reyes.
Yeah.
They had a dairy in Point Reyes. And they built what they call a cheese, is a big, huge cheesecake. Well, they did a huge cheesecake and sent it to President Lincoln. And that, right after that, actually, in the mid-1860s, they came to San Luis.
It was not a cake.
They called it a cheese.
It was cheese.
Yeah, they called it a cheese,
Yes.
but it was a cake shape.
It was
So
a,
a cake shape.
Right. Yeah, a big cheese.
Yes.
Yeah, that's the Steele family did that and sent it to Lincoln. Why they left where?
Point Reyes?
Point Reyes? No.
Because they did not own their land. They leased it from the Shopter, who was a dynasty up there. And they wouldn't give them any land, they wouldn't sell it. So they, after the drought here in the sixties, they decided to go looking, and they ended up in Anaheim.
And we won't get into it, but they were involved in so many lawsuits in this
Yes.
county. Everybody that sold them property later on tried to sue them and everything because they fenced it in. They put up fences. Before that, you would just let your cattle roam free. Okay, so there was a lot of lawsuits and stuff, but basically, yeah, George Steele's were the ones that came down from Marin, and his brother. I just give George credit because that's the one I've learned the most about. Now Ellis Street in San Luis is named after George Steele's wife, Ella. And the most interesting character is Breck Street. Do you know Breck Street? Breck is a guy you really should research. I won't get into any more about Breck, but he's really interesting.
in New York City, when I was a child, there was still a very vibrant Italian Swiss colony in the North Bay. And they had this commercial promoting them. It was the Italian, Swiss Italian. Anyway, the commercial was done by a guy named Jesse White. And they were in the commercial, they're holding auditions for someone who can say Napa Sonoma Mendocino. Napa Sonoma Mendocino. And of course, they all say Napa Mendocino.
Oh.
It's very, very funny.
You were saying when people came in the 29 and after that, there were so many people. I heard you say organized to keep them, something like that. Some kind of violence or, people in the area were not able, seeing suddenly so many people hungry, trying to look for something to eat.
Oh, they were definitely not welcomed here in this county when, all through the 30s, the migrant workers were,
It wasn't like in the San Joaquin with the Great Arrest.
no, but
But
they
there
were
was
definitely
definitely
not.
discrimination around here.
Because, especially because they were often hungry, even, when they were able to work and be paid. And the locals were pretty withholding in terms of, helping them in situations. I mean, in that 1932 exhibit or instance, they were fed, when the labor contractor absconded with the funds, but there were many other instances where they were in trouble. Well, in fact, when Dorothea Lange was taking photos of Florence Thompson for the Migrant Mother series, when Florence Thompson later on, 20 years later, realized that she was famous, she was very proud. Well, for one thing, she said Dorothea Lange totally misidentified Florence Thompson's situation. But and Florence Thompson was very pleased that for the most part, they did not go hungry, but that a lot of other people in the camps where they would be picking were going hungry. And so it was a very precarious situation. I don't know, I did not see when I was researching it that there was violence against either the migrants or that the migrants were causing,
Trouble.
any kind of trouble,
Mm.
And
For the most part, the migrants came in old, shabby, dilapidated vehicles. They were very poorly dressed, as opposed to the Swiss, who were not appearing, they were very person. That's why, plus the
Number two is they didn't discriminate. The people that were coming in the Great Depression were the Okies,
yes.
okay? Plus a lot of Mexican Americans that were brought in under the Bracero program. So they weren't discriminated against because of the way they dressed, and the Swiss got by because they dressed so nicely. They were just apart, number one. Number two, Italy didn't become a country until the 1860s. So like, for instance, when the Avila Murray came to California, Italy wasn't a country. They came to escape Garibaldi, who was drafting people to fight to make Italy a united country. That's another thing. Then the third thing is, Roberta, why do you think Roosevelt did these reforms? Did he just think, oh, that'll just be great? And his Harry Hopkins said, well, what if we do this?
you mean, why was he trying to?
What was motivating him to do the changes
Well,
he did?
there was fascism coming from the right and communism coming from the left. So it was to save capitalism.
Well, he claimed it was to save capitalism, but you got to remember in 1934, in the governorship of California, the EPIC program, which was begun, which was End Poverty in California. And that was Upton Sinclair, the famous novelist. And they had this amazing, and Roosevelt was under a lot of pressure to endorse Upton Sinclair, but he kept hesitating and he kept hesitating, and he kept hesitating. And eventually, Hearst and Mayor of Metro Golden Mayor put in millions of dollars and smeared Upton Sinclair. It was the first really big smear campaign, and that happened. Then the Communist Party was huge in California. So was the Technocrats. So was Huey P. Long in Louisiana. So there was all this pressure on Roosevelt from the left to do reform that were saying, hey, the government's got to get involved. Before that, people like Roosevelt didn't want the government involved. They were more like what we got now, until there was so much pressure put on them that they had to do these reforms.
Although Roosevelt pretty much gave Frances Perkins, his labor secretary, the first female cabinet member, he pretty much gave her free rein to promote social security,
Thanks to his
unemployment
wife.
insurance and all. Well, yes,
Yeah, thanks to his wife.
Eleanor was
It wasn't
pushing.
for Eleanor, Francis Perkins would have been.
No, Francis, Francis Perkins had worked for Al Smith
Okay,
in the 20s in New York. And then when Roosevelt became governor, he was so impressed with Francis Perkins. He really put Francis Perkins to join the Roosevelt administration. Francis Perkins was labor secretary until Roosevelt died.
and I'm telling you, that 1930s period in
It's
this county
fascinating.
is one of the most interesting things you'll ever read about. When you start reading about the Dunites and the Varian brothers and everything that was going on during the Great Depression, it's unbelievable. It's an hour. We did it.
Yeah.
You can all go.
So we could go on and on and on.
You can all go back to your cell phone. So, Debbie. Yes, we can. We were blessed by having a young Filipino student getting her master's at Cal Poly. She went on and got her PhD. But so I helped her in the research room, and she found out about everything about Filipinos in the county. Her name is Selena. And so Selena basically wrote that. Okay, and they were basically farm workers. And you know, there's a whole history of why the Filipinos were here and everything. You know, the Spanish-American Wars when we took over the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And that's when Filipinos were brought in as laborers, of course. And and actually they had their store right there in Chinatown, and which they called it Luzon, which Luzon is another word for Filipinos. But the most interesting thing is when the galleons, the Spanish galleons, would leave the west coast of Mexico to go to the Orient, to the Philippines and other places, to buy spices and other things. Then this is 1800s, this is 1790s. Now, some of them are 1690s. The way the sailboats were then, they couldn't tack very much. So when they came back from the Philippines, they ended up in Northern California. Then they would beat down the coast. Okay. A couple of them landed in Morro Bay and Avalon. Now, one of them had captured in the Philippines like 40 Luzon natives. So these were Filipino natives. Well, the plaque in Morro Bay says that they escaped from the ship in Morro Bay, but actually, if you read the journal from that voyage, why would they be in Morro Bay and never mention Morro Rock in the journal? Obviously, you don't go to Morro Bay without mentioning the Gibraltar of the Pacific. If you read the description, where they pulled in was Avalon. Okay, 40 Luzon natives or so escaped and were taken care of by the Chumash. So Chumash have Filipino blood and Filipinos have blood.
Well, one last thing about the Filipinos is the first Filipino Infantry Division was stationed at Camp San Luis during World War II. And the 54th Battalion was of African Americans, was stationed at Camp San Luis. And they were there to protect the oil facilities. They had these old French cannons up on the hills above Pismo and Morro Bay. Anyway, that's.
Was that the Filipino battalion? Because the black battalion.
The Filipinos battalion is actually when they
First.
fought.
What's the war products of the year?
Right.
Okay, I see.
But they had a number of African Americans at Camp San Luis. At first, they were just ancillary because they, didn't want them in combat. And, they were cooks and laundry and type of thing.
They also guarded the coast now.
And
And
then-
those guns.
And then the 54th regiment came, in. That's when they started.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're gonna read around the banner.
Yeah. More questions? No more questions? We love questions.
You got, maybe the very famous Californians, this land was Spain and then Mexico. And obviously, what happened with that big small population working there, and it was the conditions for them different from working for the Spanish, the Mexicans, and then the new arrivals.
What are you talking about, the Native Americans?
No,
This
California.
California.
Oh, the California.
All the time, obviously, it's supposed a mix of.
Well, actually, the big surprise was that the first, like the Portola and Dianza and Governor Pico were mulattoes. They had African blood. There were a lot of Californios that had African blood. If you saw Governor Pio Pico today, he would be considered black. Okay,
Arabs were 800 years in Spain, and they were the caliphs. They were the kings of.
yeah, but the people that ended up here,
Yeah. The official religion and you know.
yeah, we didn't go into Spanish history in this.
Yeah.
This is just some migrants that came to the county. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you want to discuss with me Spanish early history, I could talk all night about it.
Is what I mean.
Yeah, when we-
You know, I think when Grace sailors and was thinking about this, you know.
They didn't come here by ship.
Oh.
They came to Mexico. And then they went overland to New Mexico. Then they came overland to here. Now, some people did come by ship, but the settlers didn't come by ship.
When we were doing Californios, like I said, there's a lot. This is this much, you know, and really for all of them, this is this much, but yeah, there's a lot there.
There's a lot, yeah, and two, I think we concentrated on the Californios.
That's what their jobs were.
As how everything's set up in this county, you know, you start with the Californios, then other people come in, right? And you know, the Californios later on were called Mexicans. As a matter of fact, when they hung them in Mission Plaza, they called them greasers. And they were born and raised in San Luis Obispo. Did you know they hung 7 in Mission Plaza without a trial, judge, and jury? Do you want to help me get a plaque in Mission Plaza that we can, I know the group that would pay for it, and all I would simply say is 7 Californios were hung without a trial in this plaza. Is that good history?
And then one was gunned down to Los Osos,
And
by
one-
a posse that chased them.
150 strong posse. PLNRs, of course.
Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Me too.